Can we create the governing structures that are necessary to deal with the kind of situation that, in many ways, we have created on planet Earth right now? But before we begin looking at solutions, one of the things you'll find is, and then the toolkit, the social emitters toolkit that we created also does this, is to get us to take a step back, look at our assumptions deeply, look at the words we're using, the metaphors, the images that we're using, before we begin to create solutions or to design responses to these governing issues. So as a futurist, that's my day job, I guess, we look to the future, we try to understand change in a deep way. And it's a strange discipline in that it's not an empirical science because the future doesn't exist. It only exists in our minds, maybe as faint signals that exist in the present, but it's inherently abstract. There are no future facts, as we say. So we have to study, one of the things we can study are images and beliefs about the future, the metaphors we use, and they aren't just out there and interesting to study from a sort of aesthetic point of view. They actually matter. They impact the kind of decisions that we make, the kind of structures that we build. One of the things that I've also studied is neuroscience and looking at the neuroscience of foresight. Now, I don't want to overstate this. It's more complicated. But the MRI studies are showing that when we envision the future, we're using most of the same parts of our brains that we do to remember the past, to tell stories about the past. So in a way, our minds, we have a bit of a cognitive bias to imagine the future in terms of the things that we've experienced before, the things that we're, in fact, thinking about in the present. We call it the crackpot realism of the present. So whatever vision of the future we have tends to be colored by what's going on around us. So if there are massive earthquakes and tsunamis happening, that tends to color our vision of the future. If there are labor strife and strikes going on, we tend to imagine the future in terms of the things that are happening around us at the time. So we need to account for these cognitive biases. These are well earned evolutionarily. If those animals are going to eat you, they were going to eat your grandfather and great-grandfather. It's probably been consistent throughout most of human history. We've been in general in times of consistency. But in times of massive change and accelerating change and disruptive change, this is something that we need to correct for as opposed to leverage. So we create structures to help us bridge that gap, to bridge what we call the experiential gap between the lived present, the experience we've had in the present and the past, and that inherently abstract future that we need to imagine. So metaphors matter. And where do we get most of our images of the future? Science fiction is probably the predominant place. If I ask you to give me an image of the future, so just throw out some. What's an image of the future that you've seen or come across or think about? Sorry?
Blade Runner.
Blade Runner, yeah.
Flying cars.
Flying cars, right.
Stunning. Black Hawk Down.
There you go. Black Hawk Down, yeah, good one. So they tend to come from science fiction. We often have a collapse view of the future sometimes. This is Day After Tomorrow, a classic collapse story, global warming oriented. WALL-E is another one. Too much growth, right? Leading to a different future, to say the least. Advertising is another area we get images of the future. I love this one. This is just so weird and wrong in so many different ways. But okay, yeah. So New York's flooded, but hey, let's stay fashionable, right? I mean, but I think to Diesel's credit, they were actually trying to raise awareness. I think in quasi-Benetton way, like this is going to happen. We need to think about this. So smuggling in some truth into their advertising, maybe, I don't know. Maybe I'm giving them too much credit. So metaphors matter, images matter. What kind of metaphors for governance are we going to have in the Anthropocene? Which ones are we going to carry with us? So here's some examples. So this is a great quote from the former president of the American Political Science Association, William Bennett Monroe. He says, surely there's an element of danger in a situation where our progress runs so fast in all of the sciences except the one that ought to be the greatest. For although science may be the basis of civilization, government is the retaining wall that holds the whole structure in place. So calling out some of the metaphors that Monroe was using, the retaining wall. So are we going to think of government as providing the structure, providing the limits, the boundaries to our behavior and action? Is that the right metaphor that we should take forward? Is it a retaining wall? Or are there other metaphors? So Daniel Jansen has, of course, many of you probably know the famous line, so humanity now owns life on Earth. Well, there's an assumption embedded in that one as well, right? Stop labeling the wild as wild. It's all gardening now. So is the planet a huge garden? Is there no more wilderness left? Is it all gardening now? So is government the constant gardener for the planet? Should we think about government as a gardening institution? That's a valid one. I love this XK CD cartoon looking at the mass of land animals. So humans, I don't know, it may be hard to see for some of you, humans in the middle there in the dark gray. The rest, the light gray, are domesticated animals. And those little bits of green are wild animals, again, by weight on Earth now. So that's a case that we have domesticated the planet in most sense. And we should... There's the back end of that is not just to acknowledge that, is to say, okay, well, we are now responsible. We're responsible for our roads, right? If we've tamed Earth, then we have to take care of it. There's no wild left, so ignoring it is actually irresponsible. It's not acknowledging the impact that we've had. One of my favorites is to think about government as a metacognitive system. So humans have limitations, cognitive biases. I've mentioned one already. We create these structures as metacognitive tools or metacognitive systems to do things that we can't do on our own. So society is, anyway, in many ways, a distributed mind. Culture is a distributed system for organizing ourselves in some useful way. So should we consciously think about government as a metacognitive system? We build our courts and our justice system in many ways to adjudicate conflict, because we may not have the rational capacity to weigh facts, objectively. So we create systems of justice and courts in order to adjudicate these things in ways that maybe our passionate minds can't do. So should we think about government as an extended mind, an extended culture that helps us expand and improve the kind of thinking that we can do and the decision-making processes that we take? And so, the Institute for the Future is based in Palo Alto. So here's my Palo Alto Silicon Valley mind slide. So is government a platform? I often talk about it as a structure, like the internet is a platform where the intelligence is in the users. So government should actually be quite neutral. It should provide the tools for people to do things, but it shouldn't dictate how people actually behave or what they do. So is it a platform? Is it a business model, or is it a vanity project? We see, this is Sean Parker there on the bottom. Silicon Valley billionaires are getting into the government business in many ways. Their vanity project. Let's invent a government. Peter Thiel. Let's go put a seasteading institute out on the open seas and create a government, perfect libertarian government. All of these kind of, I approve of the big thinking, the big picture thinking, and certainly the spirit of experimentation. But is it just another entrepreneurial endeavor? Is that the right metaphor or model to think about government? So those are just a few, and you should interrogate your own assumptions about what you think government is and what the right model, the right image, the right metaphor could be or should be for the Anthropocene. I studied with a guy named Jim Dater at the University of Hawaii, and one of the things probably that changed my whole thinking and got me excited about this whole idea of political systems design was a course that he teaches called Political Systems Design. I don't know, I think it could be the only regularly recurring course in political systems design. Has anyone ever had a course in governance design or political systems design? Yeah, there's not many. I wish there were more. But so one of the opening lines that Dater uses in the course is that we have created our social systems. We have invented them. We often forget to acknowledge that we constituted ourselves, that we invented this world. It was a creation, consciously, a conscious creation. Much of it was. Much of it was also just sort of evolved over time. But to think about the world as a social invention, and then to think about ourselves as social inventors. So it didn't just stop, from the U.S. perspective. Social invention didn't just stop with the creation of the U.S. Constitution. It's deified in the U.S. Almost to the point of religion. You can't touch the Constitution. We haven't amended it in 40 years. There's not been one constitutional amendment in my lifetime. Yet the world has changed a little bit, in the last 40 years. Yet our Constitution is supposed to be almost untouchable. So part of the takeaway message that we try to do is to acknowledge the fact that we have the right, first of all, to reinvent our society. We have the capacity to do it, and then we have a ton of amazing new tools to actually try and do that. So, okay, we have our metaphors of the future, our images of the future. We're social inventors. Well, what do we want to invent? And so this is just what we are trying to do at the Governance Futures Lab at the Institute for the Future is to create tools, create processes, create networks of social inventors to try to catalyze experiments in political systems and to try to experiment with those, to try to actually try them out in different places, see what works and what doesn't work, and improve on those and iterate those as rapidly as we can, and to scale up the best of those inventions. So we talk about new structures of participation quite a bit. This is just a sampling of some of my favorite ones. So Loveland Technologies in Detroit. Has anyone, this is a long shot, has anyone ever heard of this? So this is a group that an artist and futurist named Jerry Paffendorf created in Detroit, one of the most blighted, declining cities in the U.S. I mean, they've lost, I think, 20 or 25% of their population over the last generation. They have all this infrastructure, all these buildings that are basically being abandoned. And so Detroit is kind of a crucible for experimentation right now in the U.S. Artists are going there, people are going there, because it's a little bit Wild West. There's an emergency manager. There's not even a democratically elected official there, and they put in an emergency manager, a dictator, basically, to try to fix the city. So even democracy is not on the table in the same way in Detroit. So there's a lot of experimentation going on. So Jerry moved there several years ago and has taken this futurist artist mentality to try to invent new social systems. And one that they created, the umbrella organization is called Loveland Technologies. So they've done strange things like they bought a plot of land and then they sold square inch plots to people. And so you could buy an inch of land on this empty lot. So people from all over the world would, pay, I don't think it was $10 a square inch to buy a piece of that land. So you owned a little bit of Detroit. You had neighbors who were concerned with that. It was a bit of an art project and a provocation, but it actually created a community, a group that came together to try to understand what was going on in Detroit and how they might play a role. So owning even an inch of land created a kind of engagement that was different than sort of at a distance or abstract. The Institute for the Future bought a tract of land there, I think 10 square inches, and the name, of course, is the Institute for the Future. That's right. I have a disease of bad puns, so I have to get a couple in during the talk. So the Institute for the Future is there. They also did a project where they, this guy tweeted, Rocky, Philadelphia has a statue of Rocky. Why doesn't Detroit have one for Robocop? So Robocop, the 80s movie, was set in Detroit, another image of the future of decline and decay. Why don't we have a statue of Robocop? That was like this random tweet that went out. Within a week, they had done a Kickstarter and had funded it. I forget the number, but they hit their number. It's like $100,000 or something. And they went way past it. And just like in a week, overnight, they had created the funding to do this. So they're still doing this. They're creating a bronze statue of Robocop that will be going up. They're in the process of building that. And then finally, the one that's up there, why don't we own this? So those two kind of cool art, weird, marginal projects actually led to this, one of his latest projects called Why Don't We Own This, which is basically a citizen created map of all of the empty buildings in Detroit, whether they're for sale, what kind of infrastructure is left, do they have electricity, do they have plumbing, is there a tax lien on it, who actually owns that. All of that information was out there, but it wasn't all put together in a user-friendly way. So developers who want to go buy up all that land had access to that information or could get it, but not everyday people. And so if a house and a plot of land is selling for $100, you could actually buy it, So having that information and putting it together was absolutely critical to empower people to potentially buy houses or to keep things in their own hands. So why don't we own this? To me, a very practical, citizen-oriented engagement, politically engaged project, but it couldn't have come out, I would argue, without that other kind of political engagement, that artistic, weird, fun engagement that actually built a community around Robocop or built a community around Loveland. All of those things came together. So it's a powerful model to think about a new kind of political engagement and structure for participation. Another one, you might remember the SOPA, the US law that was going to break the internet, as many people said. Looking for, trying to stop copyright infringement on the internet. And it was basically a fait accompli within the US Congress. It was going to happen. There were more supporters than not. It was bipartisan. Sorry, it's a little hard to see, but the red and blue are Republicans and Democrats. And it was going to happen, but the internet went apeshit. And, don't break the internet. Wikipedia shut down, all of these websites. It was a real mix of grassroots political engagement, plus corporate buy-in from Google and Wikipedia and others. And in one day, it went from, basically it's going to be passed to it's off the table. Just from a citizen uprising. You almost never see that. It wasn't corporate spending. It wasn't, it was a little bit of corporate spending, probably some lobbying from Google and the big companies that were behind stopping it. But there was a real sense of citizen participation. The internet woke up and spoke, and it changed an outcome of this law, in this case. Another kind of political engagement. This one, a great example. This is another signal from the future. This is an app that you can take a picture of a parking ticket that you get, and they will automatically fight it for you. So they have, I think it's kind of a automated system to try to fight it in court. So you can fight your ticket, and it's hard to see, but 50% of tickets are dismissed when challenged. So it's an automatic challenge of your parking ticket. But the transaction costs of doing that are so low now. So I have this app, I take a picture, I do that. Instead of me trying to look up the statutes, me trying to figure out what the date is, all of these things are done automatically for you. So you can see this kind of citizen resistance or engagement. We might call it a different kind of engagement with the laws that exist now. Again, the digital technologies, legal algorithms, all of these things are making it the barriers to entry so much lower than they used to be. So this kind of engagement is now possible, where before it would have been too onerous to try to do all of this yourself. And then a final example is Lumio. Has anyone heard of Lumio? So it's a platform for collective decision making, and it was actually created by some folks out of New Zealand, out of Wellington, and they were part of Occupy Wellington. And so this is a child of Occupy. If you think the Occupy movement is dead, I disagree. I think it spawned 1,000 different things like this. But it's a way, so they saw during the Occupy movement how consensus decision making worked really well, and everyone was involved, and it was great until it didn't work. Until it took 5 hours to try to decide what color the poster is going to be, or whatever decision. That kind, and charismatic people would dominate, and it got to be so annoying and onerous that out of that direct experience, they wanted to create a platform to to do decision making, the core part of a political process. How do we decide together? And so they created this platform. It's still in beta, but it's just an example of a different way that you combine an experience of a political situation with new technologies and the will to do it, and the ability to scale up very quickly. They're getting a lot of attention, and this potentially could scale to do not just political decision making, but any group meeting. You have to decide what kind of office chairs you want to buy, and you don't want to talk about it forever. Well, here's a platform to actually collectively make a decision where everyone has buy-in and everyone can accept the legitimacy of whatever decision comes out of it. So in the spirit of social invention, I want to give you a proposal that we have thought about at the Institute, an idea that I think is really interesting, and this is definitely sort of cognitively beta form. So this is a very early idea. We're just working out the details, so maybe you can get some feedback on does it make sense at all. But we're calling it the Global Simulation Core. And if you want to take the metaphor idea, so we could think about this as governance as early warning system, or governance as collective foresight, another way of thinking about government. I don't know if it's appropriate to quote myself, but so in one of our writings, my colleague Stuart Candy and I, we say it's better to be surprised by a simulation than blindsided by reality. And so leveraging ideas, the future ICT idea out of Switzerland, that we could create a living Earth simulator, that we could put all of this data into a model and actually begin to model and simulate not just Earth systems, but also social technical systems, political systems, cultural systems as well. So their claims are very big. A group out of Northeastern University, the MOBS lab, so modeling of behavioral and social technical systems. They are looking at things like pandemic, flu, disease spreading, contagious disease spreading. Yeah, you can model that effectively. That's critically important to public health. But they're also looking at things like social unrest, and they've model some of the precursors to the Turkish protests. There's a thing called culturenomics, which looks at media tone ahead of social unrest, and you can track the kind of there's metric for looking at the tone of media, whether it's positive or negative, tends to positive or negative, and as it gets to a certain threshold of negativity, you see things like Tunisia and Arab Spring happen. They've done all of that retrospectively. I don't know. I haven't seen it done that effectively to predict the future, but they're claiming that we could actually model and simulate different processes where we could almost predict the future. Now, I said I was a futurist, but I would definitely disclaim the capacity to predict the future, at least in complex systems. But maybe we could get a little bit closer. Maybe we can get a higher probability and understanding. It's more like a weather forecast. We begin to see the potential shifts that happen. Another kind of foundational driver of this is the idea of gamification. I haven't read this book actually; it just came out. Making Democracy Fun. Good luck. Maybe it can be, but what if we designed? My colleague Jane McGonigal wrote a book called "Reality is Broken" with similar ideas. That what if we could design the world to work like a game? Gamers are engaged for hours on end. They're at heightened mental state and emotional state. What if we could design our world to act more like a game and maybe potentially make political processes more fun? And then another driver of this comes out of the U.S. And this is called the Franklin Project. So this is the idea of public service. And to recapture some of that. Now this is General Stanley McChrystal. These folks are very militaristic establishment. I mean, I think like Madeleine Albright and Condoleezza Rice are part of this. I mention this because I feel like there's a groundswell in the U.S. and maybe other places of some kind of service back to society. Not necessarily a draft. They don't want to institute another draft, a military draft. They want to create a cultural obligation, not a legal obligation to serve your country. So I think there's this idea that of service back to your society or your country is picking up again. And so all of those things together were kind of influential to this idea of a global simulation core. So the idea is this, finally, is that you are mandated, whether culturally obligated or legally obligated, to spend a period of time playing simulation games, modeling different kind of political systems or policies or social systems or economic systems or business models. And so instead of spending 2 years in the military and guarding a post and learning, how to be a soldier and kill people, you actually go and play a simulation of a society. And so we created some levels here, so we want to make it customized to people. So the most intense level is you go spend 3 months in some desert landscape where they've created a new society, and you play yourself in that world. So, for example, this society is a perfect Peter Thiel libertarian society with almost no laws, right? So you go and you live as if that world existed, and you try to make the best of it as best you can. So so for one model, there's a 3-month intense on-site location engagement, and then you're done, your service is done. The next level would be a year of service, but you do it virtually. So you play simulation games online, but you have to spend 20, 30, 40 hours a week playing those games. Over a course of a year, you have to spend 1,040 hours playing these games, living in that world, creating yourself, trying to, again, maximize your existence there. Potentially wearing a black hat and trying to break the system. Are there holes in it? Are there ways to game the system to your advantage? And so imagine, a new economic system. We create a virtual online simulation of a full Bitcoin alternative currency system, and you try to figure out how that world might work. What kind of interactions would you have? How is value exchange? How do you do all that? So instead of a completely abstract simulation model, they actually have real people doing it. So the fidelity in our argument would go up. And then finally, the lowest level, say you need to give back, but you have other obligations, is to basically wear a sensor or either to upload all of your mobile device information to a repository, a global repository that shows your location. It may have a sensor for air quality or other environmental issues. So you spend 2 years just giving your data away to the model. That's the lightest touch one, but you have to spend more time doing that. So this simulation core would allow us to test, potentially pre-test political systems. We could try out an experiment with radically different kinds, play them before we actually lived them, and see where are the holes, where are the threats, how might it break down, and to improve those systems before we test them out in reality. And then this is just a kind of a imagined timeline. So we had in 2019 the Reykjavik Agreement signed, where 50 countries around the world agreed to give allow or force their citizens to participate in the global simulation core in some capacity. And then it develops, and you begin to, one of the outcomes in this scenario is that there's a global energy sharing scenario that was tested out in the simulation that was brought into reality in Central America. So you can imagine taking all of the computing power, big data that we have, creating all of these high fidelity models, but then actually have real actors, real people trying them out and trying to break them. Maybe we could learn from that system. So that's one example of a social invention that we might see in the future. But there are always problems. They haven't dragged the academic out of me yet, so I have to look at the counter arguments to show those where it might break down. So Jesse Ozubel is a systems scientist. He says the world is always more complex than models. It's always something, and we know this. There is no model that's going to be able to simulate reality in all its complexity. At least not that we're able to imagine right now. We have a million examples of this. So a fruit vendor in Tunisia sets himself on fire. A spark of the Arab Spring, Tunisia revolution, Libya, all of this happens. Would you have been able to model that happening that somebody who gets so frustrated that they do something so drastic would have that cascading effect over the course of the Middle East and really the world. So there's always something that we didn't see happening or potentially coming. We have to be aware of that. Alessandro Vespignani of the MOBS Lab at Northeastern University acknowledges some of these issues. So he says, how can we develop models that include feedback loops or real-time data monitors that let us continuously update our algorithms and get new predictions even as the predictions affect their own conditions? So the predictions themselves now become part of reality. And if you're modeling reality, if you model a guy in Tunisia doing that, could you have stopped it? And if you stop it, then you've changed reality. So you have to update your models. So it gets to be very complex, right? So the models themselves become part of reality. And can you model the model? And it gets to be very recursive and difficult. But that's the challenge, right? That's what they're trying to acknowledge and challenge. We're seeing pre-crime and predictive analytics for police in the US, trying to use these. These are statistical models to try to put cops in certain places where they think crimes are going to happen ahead of time. So these could have potentially oppressive kinds of applications. You could imagine that if there's a simulation that's going to show social unrest is going to occur in the next month, that a dictator could crack down on opposition ahead of time, try to go seek out the instigators and arrest them or do other things to them before the unrest happens. So we have to acknowledge the potential oppressive use of these kind of predictive tools. So just to wrap up, the goal, again, is trying to understand what governance, understand the Anthropocene, the challenges that we face in the 21st century themselves, but understand what kind of mental models do we need to create, what kind of metaphors, images, what kind of assumptions do we need to acknowledge and make explicit, and then how do we build new experiments? What are some tools and mechanisms and capacities and affordances that we have to actually try out new kinds of systems? Lawrence Lessig's quote is great. He says, "Politics is the one sport where the amateur is better for the nation than the professional." And that's true. So part of our mission is to empower everybody on the planet to contribute in some way, not just to vote, but to actually contribute to the discussion about what kind of society we want to live in and what kind of structures and institutions could we build. We want to provide the tools. The Social Inventors Toolkit is one of those to give some structure to thinking. If we acknowledge that we need to reinvent government, where do we start? And providing these tools, I mean, these are not the only tool, maybe not the best at all, but to acknowledge that we just need a process for doing this and something that allows not just a few experts, but everyone to contribute in some useful way. So that's what we want, a wave of political systems experiments, and we want it to be done by an army of social inventors. Thanks.